I have at best very circumstantial evidence. I may not even have circumstantial evidence. I strongly suspect, I would really like to test this in the lab or in surveys, that liberals, especially white liberals, are so racked with guilt and shame over the bona fide history of white supremacy and discrimination and oppression in the United States, in Europe, and especially in the UK, it's more about colonialism, right? Are so racked with guilt that there is a vulnerability to just believing anything a person from one of these oppressed, stigmatized groups says, denouncing others.
Yeah, well,
as
it's a
that kind of
very
this.
quick and easy way to signify the
Right.
fact that you're not part of the
That's
oppressor
right.
camp.
That's
yes,
right.
well, has that not been formally tested as a hypothesis?
If it has, I don't know. I
Well, it
I don't
needs
know.
to be. It
Yes,
definitely
I
needs to
agree.
be.
It totally
Well, that's
needs to
something
be.
like,
yes.
It's something like, from more broadly speaking, is that it's a mechanism of gaming the reputation domain, right? Because obviously our reputations are probably, arguably, the most valuable commodity, so to speak, that we possess. And every system of value is susceptible to gaming in a variety of ways. And one way of gaming the reputational game is to make claims of reputational virtue that are risk-free, broad,
Right.
immediate,
Right.
and cost-free.
Right.
And for
Yes.
me, if you're accused of something, and I can say, and accused of transgressing against a group towards whom I feel guilt, I can signify my valor as a moral agent by also denouncing you. And it costs me nothing.
Right.
Right. Which is a big problem.
Right.
Right. It's like, maybe it's the problem of our time. It's a very big problem.
It's a huge problem.
Well, especially now, because there's something else that's happened, right? Is that groups of denunciators can get together with much greater ease than they ever could.
Yes, because of social media.
And the effort necessary to make a denunciation has plummeted to zero.
Right.
And the consequences of making a false denunciation are also zero.
Yes,
right.
zero.
So this
Right.
is not good.
Yes.
It's like denunciation firestorm time. And that's certainly happening.
Well, so, I mostly agree. Certainly in the short term, the personal consequences of engaging in this sort of denunciation behavior are non-existent. But the consequences are not non-existent. So the credibility and trust and faith in academia has been in decline for a very long time. People hate this kind of stuff. So there was,
yeah, well, just because something's advantageous for some people in the short run does not mean that it's good for the whole
right.
game in the medium to long run.
Right.
That's for sure.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly.
Well, that's actually, I think, in some ways, the definition of an impulsive moral error. Like, if it accrues benefit to you in the short run, but does you in the medium run, that's not a very wise strategy.
Yes.
Right. And that's what impulsive people do all the time. So
yes,
right. That's even the definition of what constitutes a temptation.
I was recently listening to your interview for this podcast with Keith Campbell on narcissism.
Yes.
And that was one of the things you talked about, this sort of impulse control and short-term benefits versus long-term benefits, especially regarding social relations. Right?
Yeah.
And
reputation's a long-term game.
It's a long-term game.
Yeah.
And there has been emerging evidence that people high in left-wing authoritarianism, sort of extreme.
Now that we all agree that exists, which
I know,
only started in 2016.
I know.
Yeah.
That's a whole backstory.
That's for sure.
So, but is correlated with narcissism. And that this pleasure that people on this sort of cancel culture that has emerged. I mean, the right is not immune to cancel culture type activities, but it emerged primarily originally on the left.
Any place infiltrated by narcissists is going to be susceptible to exactly. And narcissists will use whatever political stance gains them the most immediate credibility.
That's right.
Completely independent of the validity of the ideological stance.
Yeah.
See, one of the things we'll get back to the story right away. Yeah. See, one of the things I've observed, this is very interesting, because I've talked to a lot of moderate progressives, let's say, or moderate, or actually even genuine liberals within the Democrat. Congressmen and senators, many of them. And I've been struck by one thing, and I'm curious about what you think about this, we know that a tilt towards empathy, so agreeableness, trait agreeableness, a tilts you in a liberal direction and maybe in a progressive direction. And there are concomitants of being more agreeable on the personality side. But I think one of them is that the moderates that I've talked to always denied the existence of the pathological radicals on the left. And I've really thought, I mean, this is to a man or a woman. It's, yeah. And I think what it is, I think it has something to do with the unwillingness or inability of the more liberal types to have imagination for evil. Like, I would make the case that most criminals, you could validly interpret most criminals whose criminal history is sporadic and short as victims. They've come from abusive families, alcoholic families, often multi-generationally antisocial families, etc. But there's a subset of criminals. It's 1% of the criminals, 65% of the crimes. There's a subset of criminals who are not victims. They are really monsters. And I don't think there's any imagination for the monstrous among the compassionate left. It's all victims. It doesn't matter how egregious the crime. Now, that's something I would have tested as a social psychologist if I still had an active research lab, which I don't. But the problem with what we know from simulations that networks of cooperators can establish themselves in a way that's mutually beneficial and productive. But that if a shark is dropped into a tank of cooperators, then the shark takes everything. So the problem with being agreeable and cooperative is that the monsters can get you. And if you're temperamentally tilted towards denying the existence of the monster, so much the worse. Now, I made that case because you talked about the relationship between narcissism and left-wing authoritarianism. I mean, that narcissism shades into sadism as well. And so this is a very big problem, especially with online denunciation.